Testing. 1, 2, testing. Testing, testing. Testing. 1, 2, testing. Testing. Okay. Oh, right. Jeez, the mic. Okay. Alrighty. Let's get started here. Okay, so today on the agenda, we've got a couple things. I have a headphone in, and I know it looks weird, and I apologize. My little clip-on microphone was the reason the stream was echoing. It took me like an hour of diagnosing things yesterday. If you go look at my YouTube channel, you'll see I did a bunch of audio tests where I'm irritatingly like tweaking settings and listening on my phone to my own stream, which was super fun, by the way. Um, Only to figure out, I think that at the end of the day, it's my microphone is something is damaged or crapping out. So I've ordered a different one, and in the meantime, kind of the best I can do. Um, is having one headphone in, so I use the mic through Bluetooth. It's not a terrible solution. It just feels weird. I feel like I'm ignoring you, or like I'm one of those business jerks that has like their Bluetooth on and is, talking on their phone while they're looking straight at you. So anyway, I apologize for having that in. Okay, so today is going to be the day. No, sorry, I started singing an Oasis song for some reason. Um, After all, you're my Wonderwall. So we got a couple of things we can do today. I think we're in range to sort of finish up this unit on generations. It's gonna because I added so much content. I'll be honest, I'm way behind on my scheduling, so I'm gonna have to bump education and family into the next kind of term, like so starting on Wednesday of next week after the midterm. So it's going to be because it's not much content. It'll be easy for you to study just history and all of these generation things. I'm kidding. It's a ton of content. So we can do that. We can do a little bit of review. I can just show you what the exam questions are going to look like, if that works. Oh, right. Sorry. I'm having a fight with accommodation services. They're mad at me because they're like, we need your exam. And I'm like, yeah, but I haven't written it yet. And they're like, but we need it 3 business days before. And I'm like, that's great. I haven't written it yet. I don't know what you want me to do. I can go into the future with my time machine and get my exam and come back in time. So I have like 6 emails this morning and they look increasingly angry, which is fun. Something to deal with in my 1 hour break today. Okay. So what am I talking about? Right. So we can look at some practice questions if you want to kind of take a look at some practice questions and then give you, from today until, I guess, Monday, whenever you decide to write the exam, to sort of start in figuring out what that's going to look like. Is that something you want to do, or do you want to leave that till Friday to kind of look at practice questions? You're saying now? Okay. All right. We'll take a look at some practice questions then, and then we will jump into finishing up the content on Gen Z. It should be hopefully pretty quick. I think maybe we'll see. Okay. Now I just have to remember how to do this. Right. Okay. Am I in the right course? I believe so. Okay. Yes. I also have the tab open to remind me to sign up my daughter for horse camp starting tomorrow at 9 a.m. If I miss this deadline, she will kill me. She's like, I want to go to riding camp. I'm like, I know. She's like, it's tomorrow and it opens at 9. I'm like, I know. She's like, can you test everything? Yes, I can. All right. Sorry, I have to switch the stream for a sec. Otherwise, no one there is going to see anything. Oops, that's not the right one. Like I said, I have to remember how to do all this stuff. That one? Yes. Technology works. Okay. So basically how I do things, I've got this, so you can access it any time that you want. And I don't have answers put in here, but I'm going to sort of walk you through what these questions look like and how to answer them. And usually I have a split. I forgot to do it in this question. Okay. But I'll tell you I'll tell you where the marks are. So all of these questions are going to be out of 10 marks, right? So you'll have 5 of them on the exam, out of 10 marks each. And basically for this question, right, the first part, define the term emerging adult. When did the concept emerge, time period, or generational cohort? 5 marks. Using material from part of the course suggests 2 reasons this category became necessary for sociologists. Okay, should be lots of material here that you can draw on. There's not necessarily a single right answer to especially the second part of this question. Okay, so emerging adult, right? Basically, we talked about it as this period from about 19 or 18, 19 to about 29, right? So it is, this period to defining, this extended period of growth that spreads into kind of the early adult years through college and those first years of getting established, right? Okay, what time period or generational cohort did it really appear? It really appears, and we start talking about it mostly with the millennials, right? You could make a case potentially for Gen X as well, right? because Twenge talked about, short childhood, long adolescence when we talked about Gen X. Millennials is probably the safe bet because then we really start talking about it. Okay. Using material from part of the course so far suggests 2 reasons this category has become necessary. I mean, so you can suggest a bunch of things, right? So a bunch of the markers of adulthood, and I've been talking about this through this first part of the course, right? Marriage, childbearing, those 2 are probably the big ones that you could talk about. Those things have gotten later and later. So those markers that used to, suggest that you were now an adult and you were joining, um, adulthood and responsibility have been pushed further and further back, right? You could also talk, so that's, marriage and childbearing, those would be 2 separate reasons, right? That both of these things have been moved back. So you could say, the average age of marriage for each generation has gotten later and later, especially with millennials. And, age of when they have children has been pushed back as well. Those are 2 reasons. You could also talk about, say, the fact that increasingly we've adopted a slow life strategy, right? Where it's more about cultivating people over long periods of time so they succeed in the economy and in a kind of era of scarcer and scarcer resources. So you could talk about that as well. Yeah, Mia. Yes, I'm going to say that you could use marriage and childbearing as 2 different pieces of evidence, right? I know they're related, but I'll be as chill about it as possible. Give me 2 reasons that make sense. Make sure that to go easy on my brain because I am going to have to mark 115 of these. If you or 110, how many people are in this class? I think it's 110, 110, 115. I don't even know. Whatever. I'll have to look at their tracks. I don't know anymore. Um, Maybe it's 105 this year because this room is small. I think only holds 109. Anyway, whatever it happens to be, I have to read 109 of these. So if you can demarcate, if you're going to use something on a question like this where you say would use childbearing and marriage, if you can split them up into separate sentences or separate bullet points, it's going to make my life a lot easier. It's like one reason is the later age of marriage. Great. Another reason is, later age of motherhood or parenthood when the first child is born, right? Just if you mark them off, it makes it much easier for me to kind of scroll through it quickly. And yeah, go ahead. Me asks a lot of questions in both classes she's in with me, so that's why we chuckled. Yeah, I mean, at most 2 short paragraphs, right? And just be conscious, right? There's 5 questions. You've got 60, 65 minutes to do it. That comes down to what, 12 minutes per question. It's not a ton of time, right? Um, and so you really, one of the challenges of the exam is you have to manage your time pretty carefully. I do this exam and this style of exam in a lot of classes, and it mostly works really well. I do get the occasional comment from people where, they were like, I spent 22 minutes on the first question, and then they kind of rush through and you see the degradation of their answers as they go forward. So do manage your time. It's a tight timeline to get 5 questions done, right? Honestly, 12, 13 minutes per question. And you gotta, some of them are going to be easier for you. Some of them are going to be harder. All of them will be tested for chat GPT compatibility. And I bought a subscription to Copilot Pro to really test the good version of generative AI against my questions. So it's my brain versus generative AI and how hard I can make these questions for AI to answer. So keep that in mind. It is open book though. Yeah, please. Can you go back and forth on that question? Of course. Yeah, I will have no navigation locking on it at all. So if you want to bounce around and scroll through the questions, answer the first one you think is easiest, or maybe answer the hardest one first, and then work your way across. But yeah, I have no navigation lock. I know some people do that. I don't see the point. Um, you know, the other thing is I have a fairly big bank of questions, or I will once I finish writing all of them. Um, so I have a fair bank of questions, basically that I can draw on. So um, there is a chance that you might get some questions that are a little similar, right? I will try to make it so that there aren't too many similar sounding questions. Sometimes you might draw a question that seems kind of similar. They're being drawn at random from a bank. So it's not that something's gone wrong. And if you get two questions that seem really similar, just answer both of them. Don't do this. Don't put as I said in question number 4, it's like, because I have a slight problem that when I mark them, I have it set up so I can't see whose name, and I mark them by question. I don't mark your entire exam at the same time. So if you tell me you said something in question number 4, you have to trust that I'm going to then go and figure out who you are, which actually takes me a really long time. So it would be better just answer the question, even if you're like, this seems really similar to the last question I got. You just you won the lottery, right? You got two very similar questions, so you've already found the answer. And the good news is, I won't even know about it. And so you're not like, you don't have to worry that you're like, is he going to think I'm cheating? I won't even know about it because I'm not looking at your test in its entirety. I look at each question separately. And I mark them all at the same time, partially so my brain doesn't have to change tasks every, 4 seconds. It used to destroy me when I would mark paper exams and I would mark your whole exam all at once and I had to switch through like 5 questions. I would just, honestly, by the end, I was a mental wreck because it was just so much task switching um, and a mental drain. Thank you for coming back, person drilling in the wall. Okay, sorry. But yeah, so be quick, manage your time. Don't assume that I know what you said in the last question because I have no idea. I don't even know whose question I'm marking, and figuring it out actually requires me to like backtrack a few steps, and sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Um, Depends how much of a rush I'm in, and how, if it's been 2 weeks and I haven't touched your exams yet, the less chance I'm going to do that. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, they are complete. The order of the questions is going to be pretty randomly generated. So am going to write it tomorrow. So on Friday, I can give you a sense of the breakdown in terms of how many questions on each subject. But it's probably going to be like 2 on history, 2 on the kind of generational cohorts, and then 1 which is just going to be drawn from the whole bank, right? So it'll be random. It could be on history or generational cohorts, just kind of at random. And I think I have about 30, 40 questions kind of written. I have to go through them and see which ones are good. So 2 people doing the exam in the same room will probably not even get to the same questions. But any questions so far? Any more questions? All right, do you want to see another example? Hang on, I want to, maybe someone has questions. Oh no, do you want you to cite your source on the midterm? You ain't got time for that. I ain't got time for that. No, don't worry about, like, just honestly get an answer down that makes sense. And let me, like, there's not that many sources you're going to be drawing from, so I should have a good sense. If you just tell me it's like Postman, great. Twenge, great. Smith and Snell, perfect, right? That's all I need. I don't need to tell me. I don't need like an APA citation. It is fun to make you all jump through hoops, but we don't have time for that, so let's not worry about it. Okay. So this one, right? How does Smith believe moral reasoning among millennials differs from moral reasoning amongst other generations? And here you see I put the breakdown. 5. What key philosophical trends have contributed to this type of moral reasoning? All right. So again, this is all contained in those Smith slides, the ones I'm talking about, moral reasoning. And here, the answer to the first part is that Smith believes moral reasoning among millennials is principally based on moral consequentialism, right? This idea that an action is either deemed moral or immoral, not by some objective standard, but by its consequences in real life, right? Did it harm someone? And if it didn't, something that otherwise might be considered immoral, like cheating, may not actually be considered immoral by millennials. How does this differ from moral reasoning amongst other generations? Other generations, right, the boomers, Gen X less so, but the silents, right, all tended to have more moralities grounded in some sense of objectivity, right, something that they believed was objective. And where did this come from? Like, what key philosophical trends have contributed to this type of moral reasoning? You could say that this is an inherent kind of postmodernism, right? I talked about postmodernism and the kind of infiltration of postmodern thought into millennials, even though they've not read Derrida or Foucault or any of these people for the most part. But it's a postmodernism that seems to have sort of seeped into the culture without anyone really noticing. Okay, does that make sense? It's a pretty straightforward question, right? You wouldn't need to write a ton to answer it as long as you know the information or you can find it. All right. It's taking a long time, but all right, good, good. Okay, question 3. Again, I didn't mark this one out for grades, but where that first question mark is, I'd put a 5. Um, and, a 5 for the second part as well. Okay, so according to Postman, what role did the invention of the printing press in 1440, sorry, I'm missing a word there, play in the development of our modern idea of childhood and youth, right? Okay, so what does he think, right? Well, basically, you go back to Postman, pretty simply, why does he think the printing press is so important, right? It creates a new information environment, right? It's a technological change that changes the way information flows in the society. And basically, in order to fully access the information you need to be an adult, you have to be taught to read, right? And it takes a long time to teach children to read. So you get this separation of children from adults, those who can't read, or those who are learning to read from those who can read, according to Postman, right? Now, and that's it, right? Like, so it creates this period where people need to be sort of schooled in reading, right? And then it creates this idea that they're innocent, and they are, somehow need to be held apart from the adult world. And that's how you get an idea of childhood and youth. All right, and briefly describe the historical process, right? So again, you want to hear in the second part sort of emphasize that this was a really slow historical process that took place over the span of almost 500 years, right? From really 1440 till at least the end of the the middle part of the 19th century, the 1850s, before you get a complete kind of process. And it goes from a little bit more reading is required. You get by the 17th century, right in the 1600s, a notion that like in places like Scotland, that you should have compulsory education. In England, they start to build more and more schools, right? You go from 34 to 344, if I remember, just in England, right? And so you get more and more people. You get the emergence of a middle class. It's very irritating. Of a middle class, in England, that allows them to, segment their children, hold them in innocence for longer, buy them things, create culture for them, and over time, right, this creates a longer and longer period of childhood, right? So it doesn't have to be perfect, right? You just give me some sense of how it went from no childhood, according to Postman in 1440, to, our kind of modern notion of childhood along a trajectory that was more education, more school, all of those things, right? More differentiation, more notions of private and public kind of knowledge, right? A development of a notion of shame, that's, as you go forward, more and more people get literate. Adults are like, oh, we should keep certain things from our kids. That's what you kind of want to find in that answer, right? And that develops, again, over a 400 to 500 year period. Does that make sense? Yes? All right, I just need people to nod when I ask if something makes sense. All right, perfect. All right. Da, da, da. Do I have more angry emails while I wait for this to load? Wow, that is a lot of emails. I've gotten like 17 emails in the last 5 minutes. Oh, is that my last one? No, come on, load. This is why I don't have you do this in class, because the U of A's, probably that hammer guy knocked out the Wi-Fi or something. Come on. It's like a text question. It shouldn't take this long to load. Oh, I could build the internet faster than this. All right. Maybe if oh, now did it load? It loaded. All right, so this one you'll probably get a question on technology, right? Since both Postman and Twenge stress technology, it will definitely not be this question. I'm going to phrase it a little bit differently, specifically because this would be very easy for ChatGPT to answer. But it'll be something like this: like, what technologies are most critical to changing roles of women in the 1960s and 70s? And why, right? Okay, so I mean, any question that has to do with technology, if I give you a particular time period, right, you really want to figure out what the key technologies were and I've sort of narrated this in major ways, right? If we talk about the 60s and 70s and the role of women, right, we're probably talking about two major classes of technology, reproductive technologies, right? So the birth control pill, and then labor-saving devices, right? So we're talking dishwasher and washing machine as kind of principal one. Okay, so why would these have played a critical role in transforming the lives of women, right? So you identify them. There, you've got 2.5 marks for each identification, or for identifying technologies correctly. In this case, I'm thinking of 2, and I'd give 2.5 marks here for each technology. Other questions, there might not be 2, but why? The why is going to be the really important one, right? And why? So why? Obviously, birth control pills allowed women to control their fertility much more carefully, and to better, time when their children were born, and especially to, enter the workforce earlier and stay in it more consistently by controlling the family size, which gave them more professional opportunities, right? It's really key to the birth control pill is that control of fertility. And then obviously labor-saving devices, you would talk about the fact that these labor-saving devices took a lot of the tasks that traditionally women had been doing in the home that are key to what you would call social reproduction or keeping the family going, if you don't know the Marxist terminology, and basically automated them, meaning that women had much more time to enter the workforce without necessarily sacrificing, the care of family or keeping the family going and all of these sorts of things, right? So it freed up an enormous amount of time, right? So I forgot one. You could say dishwasher, washing machine, microwave, right? Those are your 3 technologies that I mentioned in class. And those, that's basically what a question like that would look like. Identify the technology. Now, it might be phrased a little bit differently, right? We might talk about like what was the key, what are the key technologies when we talk about, particular generations. I might give you a for boomers, millennials, and Gen Z, what are the key technologies and why, just to really keep you on your toes, right? And a lot of those would have been identified when I was talking about, Twangy's work on generations. What are the key technologies that transform their kind of cultural understanding, or the way they as a generation kind of navigate the world? So yeah, Mia. So, okay, so silence, you have the beginning of television, the boomers, television, and then labor saving devices would have been key for the boomers as well. Gen X, Gen X is the first generation raised with TV, but it's also the first generation that starts to get some of those individualizing media devices, right? So we talked about like the Walkman, the boombox, portable radios, and those kinds of things. And then millennials, it's the internet, right? The internet is really the transformative ones for millennials. And for Gen Z, it would be, we'll talk about Gen Z today, it would be smartphones, right? So TV, for the silence, it's just coming in, right? So they're the first generation to experience television, which changes their view of the world. For boomers, they're the first generation for whom television is accessible for most of their lives. For Gen X, right, they start to get the individualizing technologies, cable, Walkmans. That creates a more individualistic, more catered existence, but it's still quite analog. And then for millennials, it's digital technologies, especially the internet, which again make life more and more customized to them. And for Gen Z, it's the smartphone, right? And we'll talk about the smartphone today. Okay, how do you feel about all that? Do those look too scary? And you're gonna withdraw, like half the class is gonna withdraw from the course today? Yeah, please.
Are those questions going to be included in the question bank?
I hope not. I have to look through, but they shouldn't be, right? Since I've now told you all the answers, but they're substantively similar to the questions that will be in the question bank, right? So I'll write them in similar ways, with similar breakdowns and with similar kind of themes. Yeah, so they benefit from it more so than the silence, right? And it becomes the norm for them. Again, the silence sort of experience it first, but it's the boomers who really see the benefits of it, right? Because they're the ones coming of age in the 60s, and they're the ones who are adults in the 60s and 70s, especially in their childbearing years. once we get to the late 60s, mid to late 60s and 70s, right? And contraception. Don't forget contraception. That's a big one. Even though the silence also used contraception, um, it really was the boomers that put it to its most maximal use. All right. Yeah, please.
So like for example, for this question, if you want to say like all the technology, so like for example, if you said like dishwashers and like microwave but we didn't say laundry.
I'd probably give it to you, right? Like if you forget the microwave if you're gonna forget one of those because it's probably the least important of the three. The dishwasher, the washing machine are more important. But yeah, if you miss one and you're kind of on the right track, I'm stern but benevolent most of the time. Other questions? Yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? It's like if you're on the right track, I'm generally pretty good about giving you either full marks or mostly full marks. Again, it's when you're off in kind of la la land that or I see a very chat GPT looking question. I'm gonna I you will get lower marks if I suspect that, and then you have to come fight with me to prove that it wasn't chat GPT. Yeah, please.
The first part is like my technologies. Are you okay with us kind of doing bullet points?
Yeah, I am. It's so much easier for me to mark. It's so much faster when you do bullet points. Can't even tell you. Yes, absolutely. 100%. Yeah. Sentences are my enemy, especially towards the end of the process. I'm like, wow, I'm really tired. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure we get through this content. I mean, we do have a whole other class on Friday, but I wanted to give you as much forward notice as I could. How are we feeling? Are we good to move forward? Okay, perfect. And you can access those. You can look at them. You can ponder them deeply. Don't ponder them too deeply because they won't be on the exam. But yeah, do feel free to think about them. All right, I have to switch. See, I'm being way too nice to people who don't come to class. I really should make their life worse in some way. All right. There's no complaints about the audio, so that must be better. All right. At what point is common law marriage becoming a big factor within relationships? You probably see common law becoming a big factor sort of starting with Gen X, right? Where fewer of them get married and more of them live in these kind of common law relationships. It becomes almost like a quasi standard model for millennials. And then Gen Z still kind of rolling through that first part of Gen Z, right? Who are now, I guess if they're born in 1995, right? It's just about 20. So, we're getting there. Or wait, 1995. No, it's just about 30. Sorry. We're just rolling through. They're just about 30. I can do math. It's not Wednesday morning, and I didn't go to bed at 2 in the morning for some reason last night. Yeah, so there's just about 30. So we're still kind of rolling through big chunks of Gen Z, but we see marriage rates are way down. And yeah, it's going to continue to be probably declined. Common law is going to be a big thing, although relationships are just kind of declining in general. But we'll talk about that in a sec. Has the American dream changed over time / generations? I mean, what people want has, and I mean, arguably for Gen Z, it's become more of a nightmare. But yeah, it's definitely changed in some ways. The outlines, but the whole kind of idea of the American dream that anyone can succeed as long as they work hard, right, and get the lifestyle hasn't changed that much. Okay. You're going to hear a lot more about her. You've heard a lot about her already. Um, yeah, so I'm going to take a lot of the information on Gen Z from her two books. I forgot to write the last one down here, which is Generations. A lot of the information comes from two books from Jean Twenge on Gen Z. I would say, like, on Gen Z, she's written some of the more interesting stuff, maybe along with her friend and co-author Jonathan Haidt, which we'll talk about way more as we get to mental health. He had a very provocative claim on his Substack today that men are retreating from almost everything, especially the mental health professions, and that this is kind of generally detrimental for men on the whole. Anyway, it's a really interesting piece on his Substack, which it's called After Babel. And if you're interested in like mental health in Gen Z, you should. It's worth the. I mean, you can subscribe for free, but it's worth giving them some money because it's really fabulous, and the data crunching is great. Okay, anyway, back to Gen Z. Oh, there's so much in my brain that I want to tell you, and I just have to remember that I have another like 8 weeks to do it. Okay, So most of this is going to be taken from her 2017 book, iGen, and some from Generations. The trajectory is broadly the same, right? When we talk about a lot of the things that are happening with Gen Z, nothing fundamentally really changed after she wrote iGen. Some things got a little bit worse during COVID, but the trajectories have stayed roughly the same. Okay, so why does she call them iGen? You know, everybody else calls them Gen Z, and she sort of adopted this. But in 2017, she was trying to popularize iGen as their title. Basically, right? You have an iPhone, and you have a bunch of Apple products that had eyes in them for a long time. The iPod, I guess there's still the iPhone and the iPad. Um, Now everything's the Apple something or the what is it? The dystopian Vision Pro Max or whatever. I don't even know. Costs like $4,000 is what I know, and I'm not buying one. Um, Anyone who knows me knows my love of Apple products. So she takes this the i basically it was an iMac, iPod, and iPhone. It was meant to stand for internet, right? And she thinks that fundamentally Gen Z is the internet generation, but specifically it's the ubiquity of the internet and the fact that they don't remember mostly a time prior to the internet being widely available, right? 1995, sort of the first year that we think of iGen as a generation, was also the first year the internet became um, really commercially available. So iGen or Gen Z has grown up in this time of internet kind of penetration and saturation. Okay, um, the real the pivot point for Twenge is basically it's really 2012, but it starts in 2007 with the introduction of the iPhone, right? Where suddenly, right, we all now have this black rectangle in our pockets that it carries the internet with us everywhere we go. Um, by 2012, about half of Americans own a smartphone. 75% of teenagers and about 98% of emerging adults did by that point. Um, or 94%, sorry, of those of our emerging adults. It's essentially the fastest adoption of a new technology in human history, right? The adoption of smartphones is incredibly quick and pervasive, and it marks a kind of a fundamental change. And so when we talk about mental health, especially, you'll see this date comes up a lot, and Twenge and Height will block it off, right? They'll always put a black line at 2012 to show where things really changed in 2012, because they think 2012, that year that half of people had a smartphone and the majority of teenagers and emerging adults did, is a major inflection point. Okay, so yeah, iGen basically, that trend of individuality that she talks about in Generations, growing from the boomers, through to and we find it sort of manifesting in things like baby names and all of that fun stuff, really does find its kind of greatest expression so far with Gen Z, right? So they're very much individualistic, right? Down to basic degrees of identity. Things like preferred pronouns, I think, are a manifestation of this really profound individuality and individualism in Gen Z, right? Because their uniqueness as individuals is really core to their understanding of the world, right? For good or ill. They're obsessed with safety, right? And this is something that Haidt talks about too in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which is not uncontroversial, but quite interesting, right? Even kind of psychological safety gets lumped in here. So physical safety and psychological safety become major concerns for Gen Z. And you get a lot more speech policing in this generational cohort. They're the ones who really push for a lot of speech codes and discourse policing to make sure that people's identities aren't not challenged is not the right word, deprecated, and they're made to feel unsafe because of it, right? You see a lot of that in Gen Z, and it's a big shift from millennials. Yeah, fearful of their economic future, right? Kind of fed the line that the millennials were doing terrible. Gen Z has always been afraid that they're going to do even worse. And this is also coupled with things like rising student debt and the unaffordability of the housing market, which has made them quite worried. Um, and okay, yeah. sorry, I have a typo in here when I typed this up a few days ago. Okay, they have no patience, right? They have no patience for inequality based on gender, race, or sexual orientation, right? It's a very tolerant generation, except of the intolerant, who they are intolerant of. And in that sentence, I've created a temporal paradox. The universe will now collapse in on itself. Okay, so growing up a lot slower than previous generations, right? This is that slow life plan. Lots of investment from their mostly Gen X and millennial parents, um, and really, staying young, and that extended childhood and adolescence is really a feature, right? So some markers of adulthood or emerging adulthood that we used to have, right? Getting driver's license and jobs, they're doing it much later than Gen X and millennials. Um, as teens, less likely to date. They have sex later and less frequently than past generations. We'll talk about this when we talk about sex and intimacy. Some people are talking about it as the great sex recession. Um, it might turn into a sex depression the way it's going, actually. But yeah, 15% fewer 12th graders had sex in 2015 than in 1991. And 50% fewer ninth graders had sex than in 1991. As a parent of a daughter who's about to go into ninth grade, I see no problem with this trend. It sounds perfect to me. This is the best trend I've ever heard of. Rates of like going out without their parents also declining, right? Even into kind of late adolescence, which is weird compared to other generations. Yeah, yeah. So you can see this, right? Percent of 12th graders engaging in adult activities, right? Tried alcohol, going down, and pretty significantly, right? From, if we start when we were measuring it in the 90s, like 84% down into the mid 50s, right? So, but all of them, right? Ever date, yeah, way down. Sex, down. Work for pay went down. It kind of bottomed out about 2012 and then started to go up. Anyway, you can read a graph. But driver's license, I'm going to drive my kids forever. It's good news for no one. Um, you know, and then eighth and ninth graders, right? Even declines all across the board as well. Right. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. So, like going to the mall with your friends, right? Going to the movies without your parents. It's much more common, say, even into 16, 17, for Gen Z to be like, oh, yeah, we went shopping. I went with my mom, right? Whereas like millennials by like 13, they were like, mom, give me the money and you can come and pick me up in 2 hours. Again, that still happens, but it's much less common for Gen Z. Sorry, does that answer your question? Okay. Oh, time is out of joint. Oh, cursed spite. That ever I was born to set it right. Okay, I'm just running out of time. All right, so yeah, this from generations, right? So this is really up to date statistics. 2/3 of young adults, so now we're talking about Gen Z, right? Say they've become more supportive of transgender rights in the last 5 years, and there's a big shift on gender and gender identity that's happened with Gen Z, right? Gender is a lot more fluid than it was for other generations. We see that in the language Gen Z uses, right? The proliferation of terms to describe gender that frankly other generations find it a little bit confounding, right? Non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, demi boy, demi girl, and many others, right? It's a panoply of terms that have been sort of not generated, but that have come into common use with Gen Z, and they seem to understand what all of them mean. And they're much more willing to play around with gender norms, and think of gender as being on a spectrum than other generations were, right? Yeah, percent of US adults who believe there are more than two genders by generation, right, for 3 years, right? Silence in the boomers have stayed pretty consistent. Gen X just went up a little, millennials kind of up a little. We see, Gen Z really leading the way, right? With the highest levels of thinking there's more than two genders. Yeah, and the percentage of adults identifying as transgender as and percentage identifying as non-binary, right? We see that it's much more prominent amongst Gen Z. So these questions have become much more relevant. Okay. Yeah, so proportions of those who identify as transgender has increased. And this is an interesting one. this is a really big kind of historical shift among those who are assigned female at birth, right? It used to be, and historically, people who identified as transgender were mostly identified as or assigned male at birth, right? That was the common pattern. And with Gen Z, many more people assigned female at birth has started to identify as transgender. And this is, like I said, this is a big, big shift, right? So it's and you can see it on that top graph, right? It basically you can see the difference in boomers, Gen X, millennials was almost even with a little bit more assigned female at birth, and then Gen Z, assigned female at birth just jumps considerably, way over the assigned male at birth. Percentage of U.S. adults identifying as non-binary, right? Again, much more common with those assigned female at birth. And then percentage of U.S. adults identifying as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So by generation, right? You obviously have a general climb, in gays, lesbians, generationally. Male bisexual takes a big jump, but obviously the biggest jump is females who identify as bisexual, right? So, kind of big changes around sexuality and gender identity for Gen Z. It's a major component of the story. Okay. Yeah. Gen Z, a delay and delayed adulthood. So yeah, all these things that we tended to think of as markers of adulthood have been pushed way, way back, right? And even like the idea of, do they want to get married? Do they want to, find a mate? Marriage and family are important to them, right? It's still well in majority territory, right? I don't want to make it seem like it's not important to Gen Z. It still is, right? It's still 75% of them who say they're likely to get married. It's just, and actually it's not that much different than what it was in 1976, 1979. But it's on this kind of steep decline from its peak. That one, its peak in about 2003 probably, or 2000, 2000, somewhere in 2000, 2004. And marriage and family being important, right, is in this sort of steady decline as well. So they believe less in marriage. It's something they're not thinking about, and it's something that happens much slower, right? They have the lowest birth rate for teens and early 20s ever recorded, right? So the birth rate is dropping. We see this across the developed world, right? When we're now looking as Gen Z comes into their childbearing years, and they're the ones dominating the childbearing years. We're looking at broad declines in fertility across the West, right? And globally to a lesser extent, but across the West. Canada just hit, I think, is it 1.24 children per woman last year, a very, very low birth rate. So, yeah, we're looking at general declines in childbearing and marriage, and even relationship formation. Sorry, we'll talk about this later. I could have put everything in this one unit, and we would always have been in this one unit, and the whole course would have been this one unit, because it's all contained in Twangy's book, and I had to kind of spread it out through the course. Um, so yes, I could have, everything could be here, but I have to remember there are other units and you can't stay here forever. Um, right. So yeah, all of the kind of trends in terms of marriage, relationship, and childbearing are all on the down slope and pretty sharply for Gen Z. Um, yeah, mental health sucks for Gen Z a lot. And this is broadly true in the Anglosphere, and it looks though I'm just sort of seeing people comparing the numbers in other places, pretty consistent across the developed world. Um, yeah, mental health, like percentage who say they're unhappy, obviously takes a big jump. Starting right around here for most places. Australia, apparently, they started to get unhappy before everyone else did. It's probably the deadly spiders. I don't know why. Um, but the trend is on a sharp upward slope. And I'll say this, I've said this, in the past. These are what you might call hockey stick shaped graphs, right? Where it's kind of flat at the bottom and it takes a sharp jump. Hockey stick shaped graphs represent a massive social change, right? When you see something that looks like a hockey stick on a graph of long term trends, something major, major, major changed. And that's what we're seeing with Gen Z, right? Something major changed for them, right? Their happiness levels just absolutely, in this case, their unhappiness levels
took a steep uptick, which means their happiness levels declined sharply as well. This is a weird phenomenon. Usually social trends are slow and bumpy, right? They go boo ba doo ba doo ba doo. They don't go up like this. Yeah, please.
Could this be due to the fact that it's a lot more normalized to talk about it with Gen Z rather than like
Okay, it's a really good question, which is really complicated to answer. In some cases, yes. When we start to look at other more objective metrics, things like suicide, self-harm, hospitalization for self-inflicted injuries, which are not subjective, right? Because we've tracked suicide trends forever. The data looks similar, which suggests there's something else going on, right? It's not just more willingness to talk about it. There's another factor at play. So yeah, but it's a really good question. In particular, yeah, subjective kind of levels of happiness definitely can be better reporting, but there's a lot of factors with mental health that clearly suggest something else is going on. Okay. Wait, I still have one more class. Okay. Sorry, I did not. Um, I did not keep up. I did not have enough question slides. Just to confirm, the exam will be released on Monday, and we can choose any time of day. Yes, correct. Would I say that policing of what people say is due to Gen Z being considered the soft generation? No, because it's Gen Z themselves doing it, right? Gen Z is just really concerned with harm, and they view speech in a lot of cases as harm. And so a lot of it is they're putting pressure on, it's not people being like, oh, what a weak generation. It's that they themselves are putting the pressure for these things to be policed, right? But y'all are soft. In my day, we walked. No, I'm kidding. I should have answered way more of these questions. Yes, that is what it is, but we'll talk about that later. Um, yeah, Gen Z and iGen are the same thing, just different names. Twangy thinks Gen Z is a stupid name. I agree with her. She tried to popularize iGen. It didn't work. She's gone back to Gen Z. Maybe one day someone will come up with a better name. I'm like all on Zoomer. I like Zoomer, but it sounds fun. There's a cleavage with Gen Z. Like early Gen Z has nothing in common with later Gen Z. Zennials. Why such a divide? This is true of almost all generations. Generations are not natural points in history. They're artificial by their nature. So yeah, Zennials, like, and we have when people were talking about like where I was born in the early '80s, between Gen X and Millennial, some people put Zennials but with an X at the beginning, um, which is way cooler than with a Z. By the way, Zennial with a Z is stupid. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, there's always these kind of artificial lines between generations. It's a way of talking about them and trying to make sense of generational experiences, but it is a bit artificial. Okay, I have no opinion on this last one. Is it because you listen to true crime podcasts or documentaries? I have no idea. I don't think so. All right, we'll pick it up here. We're almost done, and we'll have lots of Q&A time. We'll do some Q&A. Come with any content questions you have for the midterm. Come with them on Friday, and we'll kind of do that. We'll do these last couple slides, which are important, and then yeah, we'll do Q&A. All righty.